much. Thanks for coming. I'm really happy to introduce this next panel, but before I do, just really briefly, please turn off your cell phones. The ringer, we don't need to hear it. Turn off the ping when you get a text. Turn off all the things. It's very distracting for everybody, so please do that. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have you. I'm a volunteer at the book festival. There's many volunteers here that make this festival work, and we're really grateful for everyone's attendance and for our author and interviewers for being here today. The best way to support them is right after this to go and buy the book at the book selling tent right over there, and then meet Jordan at the signing tent after this. Oh, the books are all sold out. Congratulations. Congrats. So if you want to talk to Jordan after this, we just ask that you move outside the tent because we have a tight schedule that we're trying to keep going. So thank you very much. Oh, great. Jordan will have book plates in the tent. Should they go to the... Okay, go to Bunch of Grapes. You can get a book plate that Jordan can sign for you. So that's excellent. Thank you for telling me. And now I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers and let you hear from them, not me. We're very, very happy to welcome Jordan Thomas discussing his book, When It All Burns, with Robert Perschel interviewing him. So thank you both for being here. Jordan is an anthropologist, former Los Padres Hotshot wildland fighter, and an author of When It All Burns, Fighting Fire in a Transformed World. This firsthand account of battling California's most catastrophic fire season reveals the toll of firefighting while exploring the cultural history of megafires and humanity's escalating war with wildfire. I'm from the West Coast. I live in Oregon, and we now have fires in Oregon 24/7, 12 months a year. And the firefighters, we all just kind of think about, oh, there's a fire, who's containing it? And it is the firefighters on the front lines doing this job. And Jordan will talk about it. It is a really, really difficult job. And I don't even think we can comprehend how tough it is. But he has moved on from that and now is a Chancellor's Fellow at UC Santa Barbara with graduate degrees from Cambridge and Durham. And he writes for outlets including the LA Times and the Seattle Times. And our interviewer, Robert Perschel, is a senior advisor for the New England Forestry Foundation after serving as executive director for 12 years. Previously, he was the Eastern Region Director for the Forest Stewards Guild, and in his 40 years as an environmental professional, he has worked on forestry, large landscape conservation, and wilderness issues. Bob also worked for the forest industry before establishing his own consulting business and founding the Land Ethic Institute. He has a master's degree in forestry from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and a psychology degree from Yale. Wow, that's going to be a great interview with those degrees. So please join me in welcoming both of them to the tent. Thank you.
Flip it up. Now it's on. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm glad to see everybody here. I've had the privilege in the last week to read the book and to actually talk to Jordan about this. Also, I'm a full-time resident of Chilmark, just to let you know. As a forester for over 40 years, foresters hold firefighters in tremendous regard because we have an understanding of the situations that they're in, but also the sort of physicality and athleticism that's required of these people is off the charts. I think I'm going to ask Jordan to talk about that a little bit. Talk about your marathoners, your elite athletes that do tremendous things, and it's recorded. These people are out in the woods doing that kind of work, and it's very taxing. So I want to make sure we talk about that. So this session will last 50 minutes. We'll talk for 40 minutes, and then there'll be 10 minutes of questions. So think of your questions, but please ask them in the form of a question, not a sermon or a feeling. Ask a question so we can answer the question. We're going to divide this into roughly 3 parts. The first part will start with what I was just talking about. I want to hear from Jordan what it's like to be a hotshot, to be out there in the woods in these fires. So I'm going to let him talk about that for a while. Then we'll do a segue into how do you actually fight these kind of fires? What happened to put us in this situation that they're so terrible, and what do we do from here on in? And the last 10 seconds, 10 minutes, I was a little bit distracted. I can hear the other speaker in the other room. The last 10 minutes, we're going to try to bring it a little bit home more to the east, the eastern forest, and then a little bit of time maybe, what's going on the vineyard? Because I think you're going to ask those same questions about what we have here on the vineyard. So let's get started, all right? Jordan, as I said, I read your book about the situations you were in, the demands on the human body to even get to the fires, the walks you had to do under the high temperatures before you even started the fire, started to fight the fire. And then your crew is out there for days sometimes in the woods. I know it's a tremendous physical demand on the body. How did you get into this? What made you think you were qualified to be at this elite level? And tell us what it's like to be in the middle of a megafire on these kind of crews.
We're diving right in. Let's establish a little baseline real quick first. Does anyone here know what a hotshot is? Could you raise your hand if you do? Okay. So if you want a cool job title, the Forest Service is a good place to go. It's one of the only places where boss is actually the job title. You can be a dozer boss, a crew boss, you can be a smoke jumper, a burn boss, and hotshot is one of the actual job titles you have. And they're often considered the special forces of wildland firefighters. So what wildland firefighters do, I had no idea when I moved to California. I started thinking about fighting fires because all of the mountains around the place where I moved was torched from what was then the largest fire in California's recorded history. It's not even the top 10 now. So I started thinking about fire, looking at ways to get involved with fire, and started calling different fire crews and seeing if I could join. And I called the hotshots. They were the first ones I called, and they laughed at me and told me after they found out I had no fire experience. So they directed me to a different crew where I showed up expecting to get handed a hose to spray water on fires, and it was kind of like wondering where the Dalmatians were. But instead, they led us all to the bottom of a mountain and told us to race to the top. And with 50 pounds on your back and carrying chainsaws. And then from the order that you arrived at the top of the mountain, they delegate your position on the crew, because hiking speed is an informal metric they use for how long you can work before you collapse. So that sort of set the tone. And what I learned by going through this process of getting to the hotshot crew was that wildfires aren't fought with water. They're fought by removing fuel from the edges of the fire. Fuel is in trees, grass, bushes. And that's because, for a couple reasons, there's often not enough water to put these huge wildfires out. It's like some of these wildfires now are burning 1 million acres. You can't blanket all that with water. But also because so what wildland firefighters do is they contain the edges. You follow the edges of the fires and you contain them so that then they go out themselves. So you're not actually actively extinguishing them with water like you do in other places. And what I realized doing this is that this is the edge of fires, but it's also a really visceral edge of the climate crisis that I could use to make sense of all of these other components of the climate crisis in terms of its systemic features, where it comes from, what's making it so violent for some people as opposed to others, in some places as opposed to others. And at the same time, I was working at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as an anthropologist, and I had colleagues in a lot of different departments who were doing professional research on wildfires too, and then a lot of the hard sciences. And one thing that people kept coming back to was that we don't really know what's going on with these fires. One of the reasons why they are a real flashpoint for climate change is because the conditions of fire are changing more quickly than our ability to comprehend them scientifically. The rates of spread, their intensity, their effects on ecosystems. But there's a group of people whose lives depend upon their ability to make sense of the things that science is unable to make sense of now. That's the hotshots. They literally have to inhabit the edges of unprecedented environmental disasters for months on end, and conditions that really nobody has ever lived through in California. So I became really fascinated by what this could tell us about how people navigate the climate crisis tactically, physically, but also emotionally, and in terms of community and what it means to be a community on the edge here. So that's what led me into it.
I still want to hear a little bit more about the size of these, first of all, 1 million acres, he mentioned. That's the size of Rhode Island. That's one fire. Right? Okay. What's it like? You talk in the book about 300-foot flames and being close to them and knowing that it may be coming your way. I mean, tell us a little bit more about viscerally what it's like in that kind of environment.
Yeah, so what a typical day on a hotshot crew looks like. You get kicked awake before sunrise, literally kicked awake. Your boss kicks you to wake you up because you're sleeping on a mat in the woods, no tent, you're just sleeping on the ground, often in smoke. You wake up, you eat some breakfast real quick, you're at your vehicle or at your camp where the helicopter has dropped you off near the fire. You're often sleeping just far enough from the fire so you know you won't get burned over in the night. You do a quick preparation, check your chainsaws, and then there's 20 of you, and you just start hiking out to the part of the fire that you're going to try to contain. And it's often like a 3-hour hike up the edge of the part that is burned. And the thing about fires is, it's like the inverse of water, how they spread. They really like the most steep, rugged terrain that you can find. So you're not just following trails, right? You're actually following some of the most rugged terrain around. And you'll hike up for 2 or 3 hours up into the mountains, and that's your commute to work. So from that point on, you're mountaineering with chainsaws on the edge of the fire until sunset often, and for like 12 to 13 hours. And then you hike back, eat as much as you can, and you go to sleep. That 12 to 13 hours, what that looks like, what that actually looks like and feels like, is very difficult to describe. Unless you've done, I guess, some sort of ultra marathon or extreme form of intense athleticism like that. But what it looks like on the ground is there's 4 people at the front with chainsaws and really steep terrain, cutting bushes. There's somebody behind them who's pulling the bushes that you cut. And that job is one of the most intense jobs on the crew because you have to stay incredibly mentally sharp, because you're sorting the bushes in real time as you're cutting them, because you're on the edge of the fire. So some of the bushes are half burned on one side, not burned on the other. And if you throw a bush that's burning halfway on the wrong side of the fire line, then it can catch everything behind you on fire and endanger everybody. So you have to be able to throw things on the right side. So it's like wrestling on a steep hill on the edge of a fire all day long. While also the way that you sort it out is you have to touch your neck to see if it's still hot. And then if it's still hot, then you throw it away because the rest of your body's covered. You don't have face masks. You don't have any sort of respiratory, anything like that, because it's the physicality is just too intense. So you're breathing smoke as well. Hotshots really pride themselves in their abilities to eat smoke while doing these sorts of feats. The thing is, a lot of the fires now are too big to be on the edge of, right? So the 300-foot flames you're talking about, those specifically were occurring in Sequoia National Forest in 2021. Sequoias are one of the most fire-evolved species on Earth. One of the oldest species on Earth and one of the largest species on Earth. There's sequoia trees that are 3,000 years old in California, between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. Their seeds actually need fire to open up and reproduce, certain kinds of fire. And their whole system of the tree has evolved to allow them to survive this. So their bark is 3 feet thick, which insulates them from heat. Their canopy starts about 100 feet above the forest floor, which protects them from all the largest flames. And if the canopy burns, they can recover if 90% is scorched. Partially because their roots are all fused underneath the forest floor, so they can transfer nutrients to each other and help each other recover. So they are very difficult to kill. As recently as 2 decades ago, scientists predicted that sequoias would be among the most capable trees of surviving our changed climate. But then within a 1-year period, while I was fighting wildfires, about a fifth of the world's sequoia population burned to death. And the conversation has begun now of what it would mean to if these trees go extinct by the same ecological force they once depended upon for their survival. And so within this context, we're fighting these 300-foot flames that are moving through the forest. And you can't get on the edges of these flames. They're driving sequoias extinct. So one thing that hotshots have to do, in addition to being extreme tactical athletes who can stay focused enough and clear enough to navigate unprecedented conditions and navigate, understand, and comprehend fire behavior so that they don't get overwhelmed and overtaken, is they have to have a very, very intimate understanding of pyrothermodynamics, of fire behavior and its relationship to air movement and heat. Because a lot of the time with these huge fires, what you do is you fight fire with fire. Has anybody here heard of that outside of metaphor? So it's something that you actually do, and it's one of the most thrilling parts of being a hotshot, honestly, is being able to be in the woods and light those woods on fire. How does that work? That sounds terrible, right? Well, imagine there's a community on the other side of this stage, and imagine this stage is a road that continues that way. Fire doesn't, like a small fire on the ground, it'll stop if it hits the road, right? Because there's nothing to burn. Fire needs life to burn, and there's nothing here. And pretend you're all the megafire over here. And I can't get too close to you or else I'll burn myself. So what we would do is we would just walk along the road and you light the fire here. So the fire's small. So it's just creeping along. How do you know it's not going to rise up and go on that side of the road? Well, what fire does is it consumes oxygen. So these fires are large enough to where if you all just on the count of 3 take a huge inhale, 1, 2, 3. Right, what I would do is I would suck all the fire I've lit here towards you. And what that does is it consumes all of the bushes and trees and grass within maybe this half-mile segment between me and you. So you're essentially cannibalizing yourself as a fire because then there's nothing, you're bumping up against an already burned area, and that stops it. So when we're working with chainsaws along the fire's edge, we're maybe making a 6-foot line against the edge of the fire. But when we're lighting fires, we're creating maybe a half-mile line or maybe a mile. And so these are the tactics that you use. And I'm just emphasizing this because we don't often think about people who sweat and get dirty and chew tobacco and just work really hard as technological assets or as people worth investing in or as things worth investing in for environmental issues because we're all often looking for the quick fixes. Or it's often viewed as manual labor or grunt labor. But I think it's just the actual skills and knowledge and experience that it takes to be able to not only survive on the edge of these fires physically, but have the knowledge and skill sets to manage them in these ways and to know what to do in these different circumstances is it's incredibly profound. So that's more or less what it feels like to fight these fires.
So I'm going to follow up on that in a second, but my wrap-up on the physical and the athleticism is I love to watch track and field. You know, I like the distance events. I like to watch the milers, the record milers. You know, they get it right down. I don't know what the record 1,500 is now, but, 3 minutes and 47 seconds or something like that. But these people, they run it again and again, and they come really close to their records, and then they push themselves a little bit farther. These people in the woods, these hotshots, are pushing themselves in the woods almost every day, right to the edge of what you can do. Because if you stop fighting the fire overtakes you and could overtake your crew, right? So there's a lot of danger here. So you have to keep digging, but you can't keep working to the point where you pass out. And you have incidences in the book where the guy next to you just falls over, Now you got to take care of him, right? So I just found it amazing, that every day you do that and you're not going back into the rest area. Every day you're sleeping on the ground and you get up again and you do it again. So these people are amazing. And I want to ask you a little bit more. You've joined the crew. You were a rookie. I'm sure you got your level of hazing and your place in the crew. You mentioned one of your leaders. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Aoki. You might say a little bit about what you were learning from him, because he understood this in a way that you didn't, and I think you were learning from him. And I'd also like you to talk about the actual crews and who supports them and what their situation is as far as employees of our government.
Yeah, so you're right, you're finding a lot of edges as a hotshot. The edge of the fire, but one of the tricks is also figuring out how to ride your physical and emotional edges as well for as long as possible every day without tipping into the sort of incoherence that can happen when you push yourself too far. So you have to find that edge, but the things that influence fire behavior is the vegetation you're in and the weather patterns and the topography. So you have to maintain a constant awareness of how those things intersect while you're riding these physical edges. And Aoki, the leader of our crew in California, is arguably the most experienced at this in California. He's 53 years old now. He's been the leader of the Los Padres Hotshots for decades. And, well, when I showed up to interview with him, he asked me if I want to go for a walk. After asking the basic questions like, where'd you go to high school? Did you play any sports? Blah, blah, blah. But he was obviously bored during that because the walk is the interview. And the walk is not a walk. You're hiking with him to the top of a mountain. During which time, you have to know that you have to bring your 50-pound pack to the interview. You have to bring your boots. And you have to be ready to go on a walk with him. And he's talking to you this whole time in a conversational tone, while you're just pushing yourself as fast as possible. And the reason he's doing that is because he's seeing if you can find that edge. He's seeing how fast you can hike while actually like paying attention to the questions he's asking you and being able to hold a conversation. Because that's sort of an embodied simulation of what you're doing day to day for 14-day periods, working 16 hours, being off for 8 hours, sleeping in the smoke, waking up to working 16 hours. For 14 days in a row, you get 2 days off. You go do it again for about 6 months out of the year. And so the experience is profound that Aoki has. But even Aoki, there's limits to your people's ability to comprehend what's happening. Aoki had a very near-death experience. What would that be? About 10 years ago now, where he was actually caught in a fire and was terribly, terribly burned and was unable to work for quite a while. And, well, he had to rely on GoFundMe to pay his bills after that. And I think that that's a major part of this dynamic that the hotshots and so many other frontline communities and the climate crisis are dealing with, is the difficulty of keeping compensation for people and healthcare for people commensurate with the increasing risk that people are facing with climate change. And there's a lot of reasons for that we can dig into for the specifics, but this was a constant point of stress and pressure among hotshots during my time there and remains so today. Because burning is terrible and it really sits with you viscerally, but it's not the most common form of injuries that hotshots face. Chronic illness is far more common. And then there's all of these other compounding pressures as well of different injuries you can get. Somebody had a branch fall on them near our crew and broke, their back broke. And then people are always breaking legs from falling or getting hit by boulders. Or heat stroke is very common. And when I started, I just assumed I'd be taken care of if this happened while I was fighting fires. And that made the stress, it at least put a ceiling to the stress. Because you can recover, theoretically, if you get help after you have heat stroke or something. But the idea that you'd be financially ruined or bankrupted from an injury that happened on the fire line was much more difficult to stomach, especially after I had come to appreciate the profound experience and skills and knowledge that this community of people has, and the way that they use this experience and skills and knowledge to protect the land and to protect communities. And so I started looking into it and realized that this is really a stand-in for what's happening across so much of American society, which is just a divestment from not just public infrastructure, but from the public servants who are really working to keep things going and to protect people and places. And we can dig into the weeds of exactly why hotshots don't have health care, and why compensation is so low. But I just, as a schematic, there's really two reasons. Number one, the planet has shifted faster than our ability to keep up bureaucratically with changing their compensation and healthcare parameters. So I think the legal classification of hotshots are not technically firefighters, they're forestry technicians. And this was written in the 1980s, which is when we were essentially on a different planet. Carbon in the atmosphere is around 350 parts per million. Now it's around 420, higher than it's ever been in the history of the human species. But simultaneously, there's a political effort to prevent hotshots and other public servants on federal lands from gaining the sorts of compensation that really is their right. And this has a long history, too, of right-wing opposition to public land and federal land in the American West. So hotshots are federal employees, which means that their pay and benefits are subject to federal intervention and legislation. So if you're against public land, you're also often against public servants, and there's been a sustained effort by right-wing groups like the Heritage Foundation to prevent any form of increasing wages or health care for any people working on public lands. Because, well, if these lands are degraded, they're easier to sell off to corporate interests and eventually privatize.
We could dig into that for quite a bit, but I want to make an important segue here. So these people are out there, they don't have the right kind of health care, and they're putting their lives on the line, and they could be financially ruined if it happens to them. But they're on the edge of the fire. How did we get to this point in the American West where we have these kind of fires that are just not anything like they've been historically? And you cover this in your book. You talk about the cultural use of fire by Native Americans and how they did that for thousands of years. And then you talked about how when the Europeans and the Forest Service came in, how they basically didn't listen and abandoned that and didn't do that. So bring us up to date on how we got to this point where now that climate change is hitting us full in the face, we've got a big problem and a crisis.
Yeah. So people are often pretty surprised by how terribly compensated hotshots are, how little health care they have. But I think we maybe shouldn't be, because this is actually consistent in the most recent iteration of our fire management system and land management system in this country, I think, which is really built on these fundamental systems of exploitation. So who benefits from hotshots not having health care? The people who would be paying taxes for them to have health care. So essentially, hotshots' bodies are subsidies for the richest strata in our society, and their bodies are exploited to bolster these people. But really, the fire management system in the United States is founded on exploitation. And so just backing up after that statement, California is among the most fire-evolved regions on Earth. Most of California's ecosystems need certain kinds of fire to thrive. Now, we think of fire as a singular thing, which is kind of odd, because you wouldn't think of precipitation as a singular thing, right? You wouldn't say, oh, precipitation's good or precipitation's bad. It depends on the kind. Like a hurricane can be really bad, but you definitely want some rain, right? It's like that with fire in California. People say that pyrodiversity is tied to biodiversity in California. So where I was working with the hotshots, there's this species of plant that actually the seeds they know to germinate when they're brushed by smoke. They actually need fire to reproduce every 40 to 90 years. And the fires burn hot there. So the parents of these seeds, or the mature chaparral species, they produce flammable waxes and resins. So when they burn, they incinerate everything, which deposits all the nutrients back in the soil, and then the seeds know to grow. It's different up in the forests in the north, which takes different kinds of fire. But this isn't what makes California partially unique, is that these aren't just natural fire regimes, these aren't just from lightning or forms of combustion outside of human influence. But California's indigenous people have been burning California's ecosystems for well over 10,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, which means that the current ecological composition of California has emerged in conjunction with indigenous burning for basically the entirety of its emergences, the ecosystems we see today. And the best evidence available suggests that indigenous people, their burning patterns actually increase biological diversity to higher levels than it would have been if they hadn't been burning. Now, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around how much fire California was experiencing pre-colonialism, before Europeans arrived. But just for reference, in 2020, where the headlines all across the country were calling California a climate apocalypse, 4 million acres burned. Before colonialism, indigenous people were burning around 6 and 10 million acres per year. Per year. But again, different kinds of fire. And these were kinds of fire that supported the kinds of ecosystems that indigenous people relied upon for their economies. Fire was the fundamental part of indigenous food systems, and it allowed indigenous people to tend to landscapes in ways that produced plant types that were more efficient than plows would have been, or sedentary agriculture would have been in this ecological context. So the criminalization of fire, or the suppression of fire, started as criminalization with the very first Spanish government that arrived in California. The first governor of California in 1793 or 1794, Jose Joaquin de Arriaga, he criminalized fire. He said, on the basis that it was destructive and that the people burning were childish. Now, what did this do? It criminalized the food systems of indigenous people and paved the way for their subjugation, because if you're practicing your food systems, you can be arrested. If you abandon your food systems, then you rely on the plantation and ranching economies of the Spanish Empire. So it's a very effective means of control. And what this did is it opened the land to capitalist exploitation of the Spanish Empire. Now, what happened after that, the United States took over, Mexico took California from Spain, the United States took California from Mexico. First legislation of California state government was to criminalize indigenous burning in the rest of the state and simultaneously call for the genocide of California's indigenous people and really brutally execute that genocide for the next 40 years. And so this is sort of when you're thinking about where these fires come from, it's climate change, and then it's the conditions that climate change is impacting, which make them so violent. And taking fire away from a land that needs fire is a great way to ensure that that land gets sick and is way more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But why was fire taken away? That is a very important question to pin to the right point in history, because you hear people like Donald Trump talking about land management and needing to manage the land the right way. But you also hear the New York Times and a lot of journalists talking about it. And the source is often to 1905 with the foundation of the United States Forest Service, which implemented a policy of total fire suppression pretty early on. But that's over a century after fires were initially taken away from landscapes through colonialism and genocide. Because by 1905, most fires were already gone, because most fires had been lit by indigenous people. And so really, fire was taken away initially as a way to open land for exploitation, and now it's kept away by exploiting people to protect the industries that were put in place once fire was taken away. And that's what I mean when I say that maybe we shouldn't be surprised by the way hotshots are treated. But I think what it does imply is that this violent system of suppression is really deeply embedded in our social systems, and we're not going to innovate our way out of systems that are so rooted in our society. It'll take some sort of reform to do so. And I think just being very accurate and precise about the historical underpinnings of this and the social underpinnings of this is really important if we're trying to envision ways to get ourselves out of it.
Yeah. Good, Jordan. I think we got about 10 minutes before we go to questions. Okay. So I want to follow up on that a little bit. So we now have an ecosystem that's set up for climate change to cause this kind of crisis, right? And you've given us some reasons why that happened. But what do we do now? And I know in your book you talk about working more with the indigenous people in California, starting more prescribed burning, and that's one of the things you advocate. We need to burn more in the forest to prevent these big fires. So you might say a little bit about those partnerships, because that's really encouraging that we're beginning to do that. But I also hope you say a little bit about the opposition that we're getting to implementing these prescribed burns from, I would say, the environmental community. Okay, take it away.
So yeah, how do we actually know, we know how to solve the fire crisis. Actually, it's not that complicated. We need to stop burning fossil fuels, and we need to start burning more of our landscapes. Digging into that is where it gets a little complicated. But I just want to start, so every year, forest management and climate change are almost pitted against each other as explanations for these wildfires, and that is a total false debate. That's a total false debate, because these things need to be happening in lockstep. Managing our forests differently is not going to protect them if we keep burning fossil fuels. And we need to stop burning fossil fuels while also managing our lands the right way. And because it's these deep histories of land management that makes climate change so violent, and anywhere you're looking at climate impacts, I think you'll find similar dynamics, where you have climate change happening and then these systemic features that make it so violent for some people in some places. Now, what does it actually look like? So I'm going to hope that we can all agree that we probably shouldn't keep using fossil fuels. But in terms of land management, it's a euphemism for prescribed burning in places like California that need fire. What does that look like on the ground? Well, it can take a lot of different shapes, but I think people envision it as like high tech. Like there's people in Silicon Valley trying to invent burn bots and like incendiary drones and stuff. But really what it takes is people with the sorts of skill sets that I was describing Aoki having. But like anybody who has an intimate understanding of landscapes and fire and their local ecosystems, that's essentially what you need to be able to do prescribed burns well. You have to prepare a forest so that it can burn well. What does that mean? Well, when I was trying to figure this out from a book, I traveled up to Northern California to work with the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance to understand how they were trying to burn their forests. And they started before, the first step of this, they said, was shifting your perspective to learning to read the history as it's written into the landscape. So stepping away from this idea of nature as this land of untouched by people, but trying and shifting to a cultural understanding of land and how decisions that have been made through time have shaped these particular places. And so a lot of Northern California, for example, for me, when I moved there standing on a mountaintop, I thought it looked like my idea of wilderness, pine trees to the horizon. The Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance told me that that was a plantation. It had all been clear-cut about 100 years before, then replanted with one species of tree, really, really close together, like a crop. It's hard to make a more flammable environment. So really what they were doing, and they called them genocide forests because they were saying this was a result of the genocide of their people. Not nature, right? But what they were trying to do is transform this into a healthy ecosystem. That means being able to cut down certain kinds of trees, burn in ways that encourage the kinds of trees that they like or that they would benefit from or that have cultural uses. So on this burn, what that looked like was the plan for the burn was 100% ponderosa pine mortality. We wanted to kill all the ponderosa pines while protecting the black oaks, which had been crowded. That's a culturally useful species that was crowded out by the ponderosa pines. Great, but what does that look like once you're actually lighting things on fire? It takes a lot of skill and a lot of human expertise and a lot of accumulated knowledge to be able to do this well. Because you can burn in different ways, right? You're not just lighting a match and walking away. The very specific patterns of fire that you light on the ground burn with different intensities that can have different effects on plants. So you can burn at the top of a hill and allow the fire to creep backwards down the hill, which gives it what's called a long residence time. It gets deep into the soil and might kill certain seeds while leaving certain seeds. Well, if you just want to take off the very top layer of duff, you might light it at the bottom so then it just rips uphill real quick. Or you can light in like a chevron shape so the different parts of the fire burn towards each other. It takes a lot of skill for that. And when you're not investing in people with those skills, those people don't stick around federal land long enough to be able to do these sorts of burns. So I think two of the largest tasks simultaneously across the American West. The first one is recognizing where this money has to come from. So in California, for example, California gets blamed for forest management, but nearly half of our land is federal. It's not in California's jurisdiction. The power for that lies in the federal government. So when people in the federal government are complaining about fires in California, it's their responsibility. And what does that look like to take care of the land in the right way or to implement forest management, it means investing in people who have the skills and expertise to do this sort of work. Now, which people should we be investing in? Who should we be investing in? People with the sorts of skills and knowledge to do that. That can be experienced wildland firefighters who might want to be transitioning to a less physically intensive job as they get older, but also indigenous communities and other communities in California with deep connections to land who understand what kinds of fire that they need to produce the sorts of ecological effects that they'll benefit from. Right now, a lot of the forest management work is by contract crews. It's a huge industry around it. So it's essentially outside companies coming into communities, often really impoverished communities, making a lot of money doing the forest management work and leaving. So there's a major opportunity here, given the amount of money it would take and the amount of investment it would take to do what we need to do to mitigate wildfires and make our forests more resilient. Huge opportunity to invest that money from the federal government into local communities to empower them, especially historically marginalized and oppressed communities, largely indigenous communities in California, to empower them and give them the resources that it takes to do what you need to do to manage forests in the right way. So when you talk about environmental justice and the relationship between climate change and inequality, I think a lot of the time it gets abstract or becomes like a bumper sticker point. But with wildfires in California, it's very material. It's very concrete. And not just in California, but I think all across the United States and largely all around the world as well.
That was great. It's a good way to move ourselves into the question and answer period. So we have a few minutes here. There are microphones around. If anybody has a question, we'd like to hear it. Here you go.
Hey, this was fantastic. Thank you. I was hoping you could speak to the relationship between incarcerated firefighters and hotshots, if there is any, and what that sort of looks like on the ground.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. And it's one that I think relates to this, what I was talking about earlier, of the way in which our fire management system is built on exploitation fundamentally. And how even within the fire management system, there's different hierarchies and different levels and different strata and different exposures to risk. And I think this was very evident in the wildfires, the urban wildfires in Los Angeles this last January. There was a lot of attention, rightfully so, to all of the displaced people, to all of the homes that were burned. But the different exposures to risk that wildland firefighters faced also was very profound, because there are a lot of people coming from the Forest Service, a lot of incarcerated crews coming who normally are fighting fires in the mountains, where the smoke is not good for you. It gives you chronic health effects eventually. But it is fundamentally a different kind of smoke than all of the cars and houses and all of the things that are in the air when a city is burning. Urban firefighters, municipal firefighters have good health care, pretty good compensation, and equipment to protect them from these things. The Forest Service employees coming in didn't have masks. They were just breathing it. I asked somebody if he was wearing a mask while he was in LA fighting fires, and he threatened to punch me for implying that he's a sissy, which gets into the masculine ethics as well, which I guess we could talk about. But with incarcerated firefighters, I think it's all distilled into a very violent space where not only is there the same levels of lack of protection with things like masks, but there's even less incentive to bring up risks or health problems because of the worry that you'd get sent back to the relative violence of being incarcerated, of being in prison. And the system's justified by the idea that the firefighters aren't forced to do it, they have a choice. But the limited parameters of the choices available to you when you're imprisoned, and especially the largely black and brown communities in these situations, just is, it's a mirage of choice, and it's a mirage that exploits people who have been historically exploited. Again, who's benefiting from not paying them? It's a way to cut the costs of putting out fires. It's the richest people in society who should be paying higher taxes so that incarcerated people are not working for, I think, $2 a day often with no health care and no good idea of having health care once they get out and are dealing with the health impacts. So That's a very good question.
I used to live in Colorado where there's a growing industry of privatized fire crews specifically for the ultra-rich or large corporations to protect their properties, and then sort of everybody else can fend for themselves. How can we rebalance that equation so fire's no longer the enemy and just the ultra-wealthy are protected with their own crews so the actual areas that need it can get assistance?
The justification, there's a transition occurring in fire management in the United States that was just pointed to, where the public sector is being hollowed out and contracts are being handed out to private companies to handle what the public sector was doing. And the idea is that the public sector, that the Forest Service especially, isn't doing a good job. And a lot of the reason for why the Forest Service isn't able to do a good job is because it's so chronically underfunded. And what you often see is these compounding inequities in protection with this. But it mirrors a lot of society. You see a very similar thing happening with the privatization of security with the military, and with the hollowing out of with SpaceX and growing instead of NASA. And I think just fundamentally it's a matter of private interests being served over public interests. And the justification for this is often the idea that these public institutions are inherently inefficient, which is then used to further hollow out these institutions. And that's misplacing the problem, in my opinion, where the real problem is that the boundaries and the guardrails between private interests and the public sector have been eroded, which then skews the public sector and shifts the incentive structure and shifts who the public sector is serving. And so I think just fundamentally it's a matter of pinpointing the problem to rebuilding these barriers to keep private interests out of the public sector so that a little bit of concentrated wealth doesn't have a disproportionate voice over what our public sector does and who it protects.
One more question.
I'm a year-round resident for 40 years. Are there any great ideas on how we can get our local fire departments more involved in prescribed burns?
There are, actually. There are. So I talk a lot about California, but North America in general is incredibly, beautifully flammable. It can be really scary, but it's also such a special opportunity to connect with your ecosystems by figuring out what kinds of fire may have historically existed there and what kinds of fire the landscapes might need today. And not just to connect with your ecosystems, but to connect with your region's history and often the indigenous people who've lived in this area and how people have used fire in these areas. But then actually the act of doing a prescribed burn brings people together because burns impact different people in different industries. So you have to bring together a wide range of people to get a burn done. So how to get fire departments more involved with prescribed burns? Often the way I see it start in California and places where fire hasn't been introduced for over a century is you start small. You start with a really small burn to bring together the different people who have to be involved with it and to get those conversations going. So you're not going to start off having a huge environmental impact until you can create the social cohesion that it would take to get people on the same page and to start these conversations about what do your ecosystems need and what do people want and need in these areas and who is going to have a seat at that table. So I'd say start small and start social. Start in the community.
Thank you.
That was a great way to conclude. Thank you so much to both of you. And don't forget, you can buy a book plate in the tent, the sales tent, and then Jordan will be signing them over in the signing tent. And thank you so much, everybody. And we're